In September 1943, Japanese naval aviators stationed at Rabaul began filing reports that troubled their commanders more than any intelligence briefing could. The reports didn't concern American numbers. They didn't mention new aircraft. They described something far more unsettling. American pilots who fought like no Americans they'd ever encountered before. Pilots who seemed to have abandoned every principle of Western military discipline. Pilots who hunted. The squadron responsible had a name that would become legend, VMF 214, but the world would know them differently, the Black Sheep Squadron, and the man leading them shouldn't have been flying at all. Major Gregory Boyington was 31 years old in the fall of 1943. By every conventional measure, his military career should have ended years earlier. He drank too much, he accumulated debts that horrified his superiors. He'd been court-martialed for insubordination. He'd resigned from the Marines in disgrace, joined the Flying Tigers in China as a mercenary, clashed with Claire Chennault himself, and returned to the United States as a man without a country, militarily speaking. The Marines only took him back because the Pacific was consuming pilots faster than training commands could replace them. For over a year, Boyington watched younger, less experienced pilots deployed to combat while he languished in administrative positions stateside. Then, in August 1943, someone in Marine Corps planning had an unusual idea. The Corps had accumulated a collection of replacement pilots who didn't fit existing squadron structures, veterans with personality conflicts, skilled pilots whose attitudes made them unwelcome, men who could fly, some brilliantly, but who couldn't function under traditional command. The solution was elegant in its desperation. Give them all to Boyington. Let the ultimate misfit lead the misfits. See what happens. What happened would change aerial warfare in the Pacific forever. To understand the shock that rippled through Japanese aviation circles, you need to understand what Japanese pilots expected from Americans in 1943. For nearly 2 years, they dominated Pacific skies with what seemed like supernatural superiority. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters were marvels. At just 5,300 pounds fully loaded, they could outturn virtually any Allied fighter. Their 20mm cannons packed devastating firepower. Their range was extraordinary. But the real advantage wasn't the aircraft, it was the men flying them. Japanese naval aviators underwent training that would have broken most men. Years of rigorous preparation that started in the mid-1930s, formation flying practiced until they could maintain perfect positioning in their sleep, aerial gunnery studied until they achieved mathematical precision, and undergirding everything, a warrior code that valued honor above life itself. By contrast, early American pilots seemed almost amateurish. They flew outdated aircraft, they were consistently outmaneuvered. In some early engagements, Japanese pilots achieved kill ratios of 10-1 or better. The statistics were sobering. The pattern was clear. American pilots were brave, but they were predictable. They flew tight formations. They emphasized mutual support and formation integrity. They fought defensively, focused on protecting bombers rather than hunting enemy fighters. Japanese pilots could anticipate them, counter them, defeat them. Then VMF 214 arrived and the rules changed. Boyington's training philosophy, developed during his time with the Flying Tigers, was heretical by 1943 standards. On the first day at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, he gathered his hand-picked collection of troublemakers and told them something no other squadron commander would dare say. Forget everything you've been taught about formation flying. Forget about pretty patterns and textbook maneuvers. We're going to learn how to fight dirty, and we're going to win. His pilots were skeptical. Many had been burned by previous commanders who'd promised opportunities only to deliver punishment details. But Boyington had something none of those other commanders possessed: 6 confirmed kills against Japanese aircraft in China. He'd fought Zeros and survived. He knew their strengths. More importantly, he knew their weaknesses. The Zero's legendary maneuverability was also its greatest vulnerability. Japanese pilots had become so dependent on turning fights that they often ignored other tactical options. They expected American pilots to accept those turning fights, to play to Japanese strengths. Boyington taught his pilots something different. Hit and run. Use your speed to get in close, take your shot, and get out before they can react. Never, ever try to turn with a zero. You'll lose every time. The Corsair, with its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine producing 2,000 horsepower, was perfectly suited for this approach. It was faster than the Zero, it climbed faster, it could dive away from danger, but it required pilots to think differently, to fight like hunters rather than soldiers. For 6 weeks at El Toro, VMF 214 practiced what other squadrons would call chaos. They learned to break formation effectively. They practiced improvisation. They drilled on energy management, using altitude and speed as weapons. Most importantly, Boyington taught them aggressive opportunism. A good pilot is always looking for an advantage. A great pilot creates his own advantages. The squadron's unconventional methods raised eyebrows among traditional Marine officers, but the results were undeniable. These misfits were developing a cohesion and confidence that impressed even their critics. In September 1943, they deployed to Munda Airfield in the Solomon Islands, ready to prove themselves. None of them imagined what would happen next. October 1st, 1943. The mission briefing was routine. Escort SBD Dauntless dive bombers on a strike against Balalay Island. Intelligence suggested moderate enemy fighter opposition, perhaps a dozen Zeros. Standard escort procedure called for tight formation with the bombers, maintaining defensive posture throughout the mission. Boyington had other plans. "We're going to split into 4 plane divisions," he explained to his pilots. "Each division operates independently, looking for targets of opportunity. Stay flexible, stay aggressive, and remember, speed is life." It was a radical departure from doctrine, but at 0800 hours, 24 Corsairs took off from Munda, following 12 Dauntlesses north. As the formation approached Balalay, Boyington implemented his tactical plan. Instead of clustering around the bombers, he led his Corsairs in a wide sweep around the target area, hunting for Japanese fighters. The response came at 0845 hours. 8 Zeros appeared from the direction of Kahili Airfield, climbing hard to intercept. For the Japanese pilots, this looked like a routine mission. American bombers, predictable escort patterns, opportunities to exploit superior maneuverability. They'd flown this script dozens of times before. But VMF 214 wasn't following the script. As the Zeros climbed toward the bombers, Boyington's voice crackled over the radio. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high. All divisions attack at will." What happened next would be discussed in Japanese ready rooms for months. Instead of waiting defensively, the Corsairs immediately split into their pre-planned divisions and began a coordinated assault from multiple angles. The lead Zero pilot, a veteran with over 50 combat missions, suddenly found himself facing not 1 or 2 American fighters, but an entire division of Corsairs diving on his formation from different directions. His training told him to turn into the attack, to force the Americans into a turning fight where Japanese advantages would become apparent. But the Corsairs didn't cooperate. They slashed through the Zero formation at high speed, fired quick bursts, then climbed away before the Japanese pilots could react. Every time a Zero turned to engage one Corsair, another appeared from a different angle. The Americans were using speed and teamwork to create multiple threats simultaneously, forcing the Zeros to react rather than dictate the engagement's terms. Within minutes, 3 Zeros were falling toward the ocean. The remaining Japanese fighters, faced with an enemy that refused to fight according to established patterns, broke off and fled toward their home base. VMF 214 returned to Munda with 3 confirmed kills and 0 losses. It was a stunning debut. But more importantly, they demonstrated tactics that would soon revolutionize American fighter operations throughout the Pacific. The intelligence reports that reached Japanese headquarters at Rabaul that evening were disturbing. 8 experienced Zero pilots had engaged what appeared to be a routine escort mission, only to encounter tactics they'd never seen before. 3 aircraft lost. The survivors described American fighters operating with coordination and aggressiveness that defied conventional understanding. They didn't fight like Americans. They fought like us, but with better aircraft. For Japanese commanders, this was troubling on multiple levels. By October 1943, Japanese aviation was already facing a crisis that went beyond individual battles. Aircraft production, while still substantial, was falling behind the pace of losses. More critically, the pool of experienced pilots that had given Japanese aviation its early dominance was being steadily depleted. The men who'd trained for years before the war, who'd honed their skills in China, who'd perfected their techniques in the early Pacific campaigns, they were irreplaceable. The Japanese training system, designed for peacetime conditions, simply couldn't produce replacement pilots at the rate combat was consuming them. Every experienced pilot lost represented not just a tactical setback, but a strategic catastrophe. If American pilots were developing tactics that could consistently defeat Japanese aviators, the implications were ominous. VMF 214 continued their aggressive operations throughout October. Each engagement validated Boyington's approach while demonstrating to Japanese pilots that the rules were changing. By the end of the month, the Black Sheep had shot down 23 Japanese aircraft while losing only 3 of their own. But they were also attracting attention. Japanese intelligence identified VMF 214 as a priority target. Plans were being made to deal with this troublesome squadron. Plans that would bring the Black Sheep face to face with some of the most experienced and dangerous pilots in the Japanese Navy. November 11, 1943. VMF 214 was flying a routine fighter sweep over Bougainville when they encountered something they'd never seen before. Japanese fighters that seemed to anticipate their every move. The engagement began typically enough. 24 Corsairs in their usual loose formation, hunting for targets. Intelligence had reported moderate enemy activity, perhaps a dozen Zeros. But what they found instead was a carefully orchestrated trap. As the Black Sheep approached what appeared to be a small Japanese formation, additional enemy aircraft began appearing from multiple directions. This wasn't random encounters, this was coordinated, planned. The Japanese had studied VMF 214's tactics and developed specific countermeasures. Bandits everywhere! The urgent radio call from one of Boyington's wingmen carried real alarm. They're coming from all directions. For the first time since arriving in the Pacific, VMF 214 found themselves facing an enemy that understood their tactics as well as they did. The Japanese pilots were using the Corsair's own aggressive tendencies against them, drawing them into situations where superior numbers could negate American technological advantages. Leading the Japanese formation was Lieutenant Hiroshi Nishizawa, perhaps the most skilled fighter pilot in the Japanese Navy. Known to his fellow pilots as the Devil, Nishizawa had over 100 confirmed victories. His assignment was simple: find the Black Sheep Squadron and destroy it. Flying a specially modified Zero with enhanced engine performance, Nishizawa demonstrated why he was considered one of the Pacific's most dangerous pilots. He seemed to anticipate the Corsair's attacks before they developed, positioning himself to exploit every tactical mistake. "This guy's different," Boyington radioed to his pilots as he found himself in a turning fight with the Nishizawa Zero. "He knows what we're going to do before we do it." The engagement lasted nearly 30 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat. When it finally ended, VMF 214 had lost 4 Corsairs, their heaviest casualties since arriving in the Pacific. But Japanese losses were even severer. 7 Zeros destroyed, including several flown by experienced pilots whose deaths represented irreplaceable losses. Both sides realized something fundamental: the easy victories were over. Every engagement from now on would be a test of skill between pilots who represented the best their respective nations could field. The psychological pressure was mounting. Staff Sergeant Henry Miller, after his 15th mission, found himself unable to sleep,
haunted by images of burning aircraft and falling pilots. We're not the same guys who left California. Something's changed in all of us. Japanese pilots faced even grimmer realities. Unlike American pilots who could expect rotation home after completing a tour, Japanese aviators flew until they were killed, wounded, or the war ended. This created a fatalistic mindset that affected tactical decisions. Every mission might be their last. December 17, 1943. The mission briefing at Munda seemed routine. Escort B-25 Mitchell bombers to a strike on Japanese shipping in Simpson Harbor, then conduct a fighter sweep over Rabaul. Intelligence estimated moderate opposition, perhaps 20 to 30 Zeros. But what intelligence failed to detect was the largest concentration of Japanese fighter aircraft assembled in the South Pacific since the war's early days. Over 100 fighters, drawn from elite units throughout the region, were waiting for VMF 214's arrival. The trap was sprung as the American formation approached the target. Wave after wave of Japanese fighters appeared from multiple directions, climbing hard to intercept. "Jesus Christ," came the stunned radio transmission. "There must be 100 of them." The sky above Rabaul filled with aircraft locked in the largest aerial battle of the Pacific War to date. Boyington recognized that conventional tactics would be suicide against such overwhelming numbers. He made the decision that would become legendary. "All Black Sheep, this is Pappy. Break into sections and hunt. Use your speed, use your climb rate, and don't get trapped in turning fights. We're going to show these bastards what American pilots can do when they're really pissed off."
24 American pilots, outnumbered more than 4 to 1, took on the cream of Japanese naval aviation in a battle that would be discussed for decades. The key to VMF 214's survival was their ability to adapt. Instead of engaging every Japanese fighter they encountered, they focused on creating local superiority through coordination and communication. Two plane elements would work together to isolate individual Japanese fighters, using their aircraft's performance advantages to dictate each engagement's terms. Nishizawa, leading the Japanese effort, found himself facing an enemy that had evolved beyond his ability to predict or counter. "They are not fighting like Americans anymore," he radioed to his wingman. "They're fighting like... I don't know what they're fighting like." It was a telling observation. VMF 214 had evolved beyond conventional American fighter tactics, developing an approach that combined Japanese flexibility with American technological superiority. They'd become something new, something uniquely dangerous. The battle raged for over an hour across hundreds of square miles. When it finally ended, the statistics were staggering. VMF 214 had shot down 26 Japanese aircraft while losing only 6 of their own. But more importantly, they'd broken the back of Japanese fighter resistance in the Solomons. Among the Japanese losses was Nishizawa himself, shot down by Boyington in a head-to-head engagement that lasted less than 30 seconds but represented the culmination of months of tactical evolution. As surviving aircraft limped back to their respective bases, both sides realized something fundamental had changed. The Japanese had committed their best pilots and aircraft to destroying VMF 214, and they'd failed decisively. The psychological impact would resonate throughout Japanese aviation for the remainder of the war. The Battle of Rabaul marked the end of Japanese air superiority in the South Pacific. It represented a fundamental shift that would influence the Pacific War's course for years to come. For VMF 214, the victory came at significant cost. 6 pilots lost in a single engagement was their heaviest casualty count, and the psychological toll was evident. The easy confidence of early missions was replaced by grim professionalism. But the squadron's reputation was now secure. Word of their victory spread throughout the Pacific theater, inspiring other American fighter units to adopt similar tactics. The rigid formation flying and defensive mindset that had characterized early operations gave way to a more flexible, aggressive approach. Japanese aviation, meanwhile, showed signs of the attrition that would eventually cripple their effectiveness.
The loss of experienced pilots like Nishizawa represented not just tactical setbacks, but strategic catastrophes. The Japanese training system couldn't replace such losses at the rate they were being incurred. By January 1944, VMF 214 completed their tour of duty. Their final statistics: 97 confirmed aerial victories against 20 losses, a kill ratio that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. But their real contribution went far beyond numbers. They demonstrated that American pilots, properly trained and equipped, could not only match Japanese performance, but exceed it. The human cost was evident in the faces of men who gathered for their final squadron photograph at Munda. These weren't the same pilots who'd left California 6 months earlier. Combat had aged them in ways beyond chronology, marking them with the 1,000-yard stare of sustained aerial combat veterans. For Boyington, the tour's end marked both triumph and tragedy. His personal score of 28 confirmed victories made him one of the war's leading American aces, but his methods had earned him enemies within the military establishment. Signs of combat fatigue were becoming evident. The drinking that had always been a problem was worsening. His relationships with superior officers were deteriorating. 3 days after his final victory on January 6, 1944, Boyington was shot down during a mission over Rabaul and captured by Japanese forces. His loss marked the effective end of VMF 214's combat operations under his leadership. The squadron's legacy, however, was just beginning. The tactical innovations they pioneered became standard throughout American fighter aviation, influencing operations not just in the Pacific, but in Europe as well. Their emphasis on flexibility, aggression, and individual initiative within a framework of mutual support became hallmarks of American fighter doctrine. For Japanese pilots who survived encounters with VMF 214, the psychological impact was profound. Captain Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces, later wrote, "We had been taught that American pilots were inferior, that they lacked the spiritual strength necessary for aerial combat. But these new Americans fought with determination and skill that matched our own. Worse, they had aircraft superior to ours in almost every respect." The technological gap was decisive. While the Zero was revolutionary in 1940, by 1943 it was being outclassed by newer American fighters. Japanese industries struggling under Allied bombing and resource shortages couldn't develop effective replacements at the required pace. But perhaps more damaging than technological inferiority was the psychological impact of sustained defeats. Japanese pilots who'd grown accustomed to victory suddenly found themselves consistently outfought by an enemy they had been taught to despise. The spiritual superiority central to Japanese military doctrine was being challenged by modern warfare's harsh realities. Lieutenant Yasuhiko Kuroe, a Zero pilot who survived multiple encounters with VMF 214, described the psychological impact in his post-war memoirs. "We began to doubt everything we'd been taught about American pilots. If they could fight like this, what else had we been wrong about? The certainty that had sustained us through the war's early years was crumbling." This erosion of confidence had tactical implications beyond individual engagements. Japanese pilots who'd once pressed attacks with suicidal determination began showing signs of hesitation and caution. Formation discipline, once a hallmark of Japanese aviation, began breaking down as pilots became more concerned about individual survival than unit effectiveness. The impact was particularly severe among newer pilots who lacked veteran combat experience. These men, hastily trained to replace mounting losses, found themselves facing American pilots whose skills and confidence seemed to grow with each engagement. By early 1944, Japanese aviation in the South Pacific was in full retreat. Bases that had once launched daily raids against Allied positions were being abandoned or reduced to defensive operations. The initiative in the air war had passed decisively to the Americans. It would never return.
VMF 214's success had implications extending far beyond the Solomon Islands campaign. Throughout the Pacific theater, American fighter squadrons began adopting the flexible, aggressive tactics Boyington had pioneered. Pilots were encouraged to think like hunters rather than soldiers, to look for opportunities rather than simply follow orders. This tactical evolution was facilitated by improvements in aircraft performance and pilot training. The Corsair and Hellcat fighters reaching the Pacific in large numbers during 1943 were not only superior to Japanese aircraft in most performance categories, but more forgiving of pilot errors and more capable of sustaining battle damage. Perhaps more importantly, American pilot training began emphasizing the flexible thinking that made VMF 214 so effective. Instead of teaching rigid adherence to doctrine, instructors encourage students to adopt tactics to specific situations and think creatively about exploiting their aircraft's advantages. The results were evident in kill ratios achieved by American fighter squadrons throughout 1944. Where early war engagements had often favored Japanese pilots, American squadrons were now routinely achieving kill ratios of 3 or 4 to 1 against experienced opposition. Today, more than 80 years after VMF 214 first took to the skies over the Solomon Islands, their story continues to resonate. The squadron's success represents a unique moment when individual initiative and unconventional thinking could still make decisive differences in major conflicts. Boyington survived Japanese captivity and returned home to a hero's welcome, eventually receiving the Medal of Honor for his service. But his post-war years were marked by the same personal struggles that had characterized his pre-war career. The independence and disregard for authority that made him an effective combat leader proved difficult to channel in peacetime pursuits. The Japanese pilots who survived encounters with VMF 214 carried their own memories of the squadron's impact. Many later wrote about the psychological shock of facing American pilots who seemed to have learned Japanese-style flexibility and aggression while retaining technological advantages of superior aircraft. For military historians, VMF 214's story provides valuable insights into tactical innovation's nature and adaptive leadership's importance in combat situations. Their success demonstrates that even in highly technological warfare, human factors like creativity, determination, and effective leadership remain decisive. The legacy of the Black Sheep Squadron extends beyond their immediate Pacific War impact. They helped establish fighter tactics principles that remained relevant through the jet age and into the modern era of air combat. Their emphasis on flexibility, aggression, and individual initiative within mutual support frameworks became hallmarks of American fighter doctrine. Perhaps most importantly, they proved that unconventional approaches to military problems could produce extraordinary results when applied by skilled and determined individuals. In an age of increasingly complex military technology and doctrine, VMF 214's story serves as a reminder that human creativity and leadership remain the most important factors in military success. The skies over the Solomon Islands are peaceful now, marked only by occasional commercial airliners carrying tourists to visit battlefields where the Pacific's fate was decided. But for those who know the history, it's impossible to look up at those blue expanses without imagining the drama that once played out there. The deadly dance of Corsairs and Zeros, the radio chatter of pilots locked in mortal combat, the courage of men who risked everything to prove that misfits could indeed rule the skies. In the end, that may be VMF 214's most important legacy. The demonstration that in the right circumstances, with the right leadership, and given the right opportunity, even the most unlikely heroes can achieve the impossible. It's a lesson that remains as relevant today as it was in the skies over the Pacific more than 8 decades ago.